The really interesting thing about the second semester is that it brings up all these issues that have to do, they become very familiar issues to Armenians, but in this time period, they're quite new, is how are you an Armenian Christian when there's no Armenia? And in the previous centuries, there have been Armenias of different sizes. In the period that we talked about at the end of last semester, there was an Armenian kingdom, the Bagratid kingdom, which became two kingdoms when you add the kingdom of Vaspuragan, and then it became a bunch of little kingdoms as well. But there's always been something, large, small, medium, united, fragmented, whatever it was, there has been something. In this time period, there will be nothing for the vast majority of people in terms of an Armenian government. And for a church that has built its structure on cooperation between church and state, this is like cutting off one leg. It's always been the secular power and the church power working together. When you don't have one of them, how do you balance? What do you do? How do you fill that space? What's the new balance going to be? Or is there going to be a balance? And so the issues that were faced in the first semester by the church and the ones that we're going to be looking at in the second semester, second millennium issues, are somewhat different. In the first millennium, there were all those interesting experiments at the beginning in how to organize the church. Should it be dynastic? Should it be Gregory's bloodline that continues to run the church? When that is no longer possible, then what do you do? So there was some stuff about church organization and how that might work. And the solutions changed over time and in different situations. Then you had the problem of how do you mesh Christianity and its teachings, once you decide what those are, with Armenian culture in a time period when Armenian culture was not basically Christian, it was basically Zoroastrian or pagan. How do you make those things mesh? So that took up a lot of time and energy as people tried to figure out what exactly each of those things was and how they might work together, what could not work together, what needed to be eliminated, and so on. Third issue that came up in the first millennium was how to set boundaries. So what about the things that don't really, not exactly don't really affect the Armenian church, but that are not central to its interests? For example, icons. What about the Council of Chalcedon? What about those movements that we talked about where people were anti-church? So they didn't see a need for a hierarchy or for services or liturgies or any of that, you know, stuff that they considered to be superfluous and surface phenomena. So there was a lot of setting boundaries around exactly what does it mean to be an Armenian Christian, what things are in that pot and what things are out. And then there was a lot of consolidating and splitting that went on in that first millennium. The divorce from the Georgians, getting really close and cozy with the Syrians, initially in the 4th and 5th century, and then again in the 8th. And then there was the question of what to do when the Muslims come to town. How much can you consolidate with them? How can you separate from them if you don't want to consolidate? What kind of alliances can you make? What kind of alliances are deleterious to you to make? And then what about ecumenical dialogue with the other Christians, which meant Byzantines, Syrians, so Greeks, Greek-speaking, Syriac-speaking, Arabic speaking eventually. And that also got to be a pretty well-known quantity. The system had worked out. That system is going to become much more complicated across the second millennium, because now you need experiments in church organization. And we're going to look at one of them today that I think will blow your mind. But, but it's no longer church organization in a defined area. It's a worldwide church organization that's growing. The Armenians in this second millennium are going to get a wider and wider and wider and wider diaspora, to the point now where I don't, they would have to think really, really creatively in order to manage this. I don't see that happening, but it takes time for people to have the penny drop. Go, this is not your grandfather's church. Now we have Armenian Christianity and various other cultures, because you've got Armenians living in all these different places with all these different types of neighbors who all have cultures. And Armenian Christianity has to deal with all of that. Is there any Armenian culture in there? And if so, what is it? The question that becomes more complicated is you have Armenians all over the place, each one with their own Armenian culture. How do you coordinate that with what's going on in the dominant culture or the majority culture where they're living? And these problems become more and more acute, even as people become more and more accustomed to them. So for people in the Armenian, what had been the Armenian homeland, it still was the homeland, it just had no government. And people across the Middle East, the experience of an Armenian Christian living under Islam is quite different from the experience of an Armenian living with Europeans who are Christian in other ways. And so there's all of the negotiation has to go on about, okay, how much other Christianity is okay? How much isn't okay? What about life as a second-class citizen? Are people willing to be that in order to remain Armenian? What about the temptation? Is it a temptation, or is it just a natural thing to blend in? How do you deal with that internally? How do you deal with that in your family dynamics? How do you deal with that in your community? Is it the kind of thing where in public you look white and in private, you eat Basterman and whatever other Armenian things. You speak perfect English in public, at home you speak perfect Armenian. How does this work? And are you willing to sacrifice that in order to get ahead in the society which you have adopted as your home? What if there's a cost to that? How does that work? And for a church leader, how do you persuade people that there is value in what you were born into, in what you cradle believe, that might make it worth it to you to say, no, I'm not compromising that far. And all of this leads to this great process of comparison. Comparing what we have with what they have, how we do it with how they do it. But there is a second option. You can simply say, I don't care how they do it. This is how I do it. This is how it's going to be. You could be a traditionalist. Nothing changes. We make no compromises. And out of this will come a lot of liturgical reform, which we'll talk about. Most of it has stuck. We still do it today. But boy, was it contentious at the time. Like the fact that our priests wear colorful robes. Boy, was that an item of contention. And we'll see there are many others as well, where it becomes, this is the way we have always done it, which is actually not true, but it's all we remember doing. Then there's the changes to the creed. Something that you would think is as basic as the creed is going to come up for contention and review in this time period. Plus the whole thing of what do you mean by it? What is that thing even saying? And then how do you educate your people for whatever option you have chosen into? Where do you find the personnel? What do you have them teach? Do you go for a traditional way of teaching? Or do you adopt what's the way of teaching around you and kind of plug Armenian content into it? And so we'll see in a big monastic school like Datev, they're going to make decisions about that. They're going to use a European framework and plug into it Armenian content. Other people will make other choices. So there becomes this kind of wide spectrum of approaches to Armenian Christianity on all fronts. Then there's added ecumenical complexity these days because you're not just dialoguing anymore with your Byzantines and Syriacs. Now you've got Roman Catholics becoming a very lively part of your conversation. Roman Catholics who sometimes are wonderful and sometimes are not in terms of their attitudes towards other people. And then as time goes on in this millennium, you also get Protestants, and then you get all kinds of different Protestants until we get to the 21st century where you have 150 different kinds at least, all with their own different ways of teaching. Plus you've got old Roman Catholics, new Roman Catholics. Then you've got all the lapsed people, and then you've got all the Buddhists, New Age, Hindus, who knows what else. And all of that you somehow have to be able to talk with in a way that expresses who you are. And in a time when it may be very hard to know exactly who you are. And then over this millennium as well, Armenians are going to have to come to terms with not just being them, but with being exotic. Armenians will find themselves encountering tall, blonde, blue-eyed Europeans who are like, oh, what are you? Love those dark eyes. And who will, so there's a kind of, like there was in the early 20th century when people got very interested in the Arab world, there was a lot of kind of romanticizing and objectivizing of people who were a bit different. And Armenians will look at that and go, huh, maybe on the one hand, this is very annoying. On the other hand, maybe there's some benefits to this. Can we? On the other hand. Exactly. So yeah, we might want to talk to people like Cher. Okay. So coming to terms with all of that across a very long time period, I want to come back in and focus on what was happening in the world in the 11th century, just to give us a little bit more perspective. What's happening in the larger world? And then we'll focus in on some things that became possible in this time period that had never been possible before. Okay, so in other places, this is the time period where the Danes are working very hard to take over England and Norway and become the northern regional power, which is hard to imagine now when you think of how easygoing the Danes all are. That was not the case in the 11th century. There's all kinds of blood being spilled over this. In 1002, Leif Erikson discovered North America. Nobody knew it was there. So now the world is a different shape. Then you find awful things happening in Europe, like executing heretics. That has not happened before. In Byzantium, heretics might be branded on the forehead with some kind of a sign. but killing them and burning them, probably not. So there's a new edge, and there's a new kind of pressure that's entering into Western religion, pressure to conform. You also have Arab science at one of its high points, when the famous scientist Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, died in the middle of the century. He left behind 300 books that he had written on scientific and mathematical subjects. So science is busting. It's going viral everywhere. People are inventing stuff. People are discovering things. People are looking at mathematics. All kinds of translations are being made out of Greek into Arabic, trying to discover the secrets of the ancient mind. And then smack in the middle of the century, Rome excommunicated Constantinople. Romans and the Byzantines don't speak anymore, or if they do, it's not polite. And then 1055, very important change going to last for hundreds of years. The Turks take Persia. 10 years later, the French take England. 20 years after that, the Christians try and get Spain back from Islam. So the Islamic power is on the decline. The Arab Islamic power, the Caliphate Islamic power, is on the decline as the Turkish power is on the rise. And the same Normans, the same French who took England also took Sicily away from Islam. So the Muslims have lost the west end of the Mediterranean. And then we have this weirdo thing that happens right at the end of the century. We're going to spend a lot of time on how and why. You get the First Crusade. And in 1099, the Crusade takes Jerusalem from Islam and makes it a Christian city again. Of course, a Roman Catholic Christian city. So that in a nutshell, there's a lot going on in this century. There's a lot of conquest. There's a lot of new powers factoring into the region. And there were all kinds of things that became possible in this century that had never been possible before. You had never been able to watch a solar eclipse, for example. It's just too hard on the eyes. And yet scientists discovered that if you make a completely closed box, so it's utterly black inside, and you put a pinhole in the side, light will come in through that pinhole, and anything that is behind that pinhole will be shown to you on the wall of the box upside down. So you could watch your solar eclipse, you just had to reverse it in your mind. And artists very quickly discovered that, oh boy, if you put that box out near something that you want to paint, you can just trace it from the wall. Then you turn your paper over and you paint, you do whatever you're going to do to it. So this became a very fabulous toy. And then they made them smaller and smaller, so that eventually you had a camera and you could take all kinds of things. So this is a brand new possibility, an extension of possibility for human knowledge. Here's another extension. People discovered that if you bevel glass, if you don't make it flat, you make it concave, convex, you do something with its surface, you can change what you can see, and magnification became possible. And with magnification, also the possibility of making a great big one of these things and using it to focus sunlight at your enemies. But it also made it possible for people to study very small life forms. What's this? What becomes possible with this? These are not chocolates. That is movable type. Started in China. And so now, instead of handwriting every page of the book that you wanted to copy, you could set the characters on that page in a frame, and then you could ink the surface of those raised letters. You could put a piece of paper on it, you could flatten it down, and you would have an impression of the entire page. The only kicker was you had to be able to do this backwards, so that when you made the impression, it would come up the right way. This revolutionized life. This is like the internet of the time. And you also had paper, so you could do it relatively cheaply. You didn't have to go killing animals for their skins in order to create books. You are on the cusp in this century of a revolution in learning where everybody has access. And then there's this. It had never been possible prior to this time to look at yourself in a mirror. You could see yourself in still water. You could see yourself in like polished metal, but the first glass mirrors are in this century. Of course, there's all kinds of applications for these, not just for admiring yourself or increasing the light in your space, but later they'll be used for telescopes and microscopes and other things. So a lot of things are becoming, vision is broadening in the world at large. There are also breakthroughs in medical care, things that had never been possible before. And you can imagine life without these and then life with these. What is this? That's a syringe. I don't love the look of that needle. That looks pretty thick to me.
Yeah.
But for subcutaneous application of medication, this is it. This is the first time it's possible. Without making a wound in someone, just to inject medication directly into them. It's revolutionary. This is also revolutionary. It's not a vacuum. Close though, there is a pump there.
Oh.
Anesthetic.
Oh.
Now you could be gassed so that you wouldn't feel an operation. And boy, was that a good thing. You didn't always use it. This operation became possible. You would be sedated, held firmly by someone, and you could have a cataract removed.
Oh.
Oh my God. That means you don't have to go blind. Unless the operation didn't work. So vision, again, literally, is a big deal in this time, as well as new medical possibilities. As we said, the world is changing shape. Leif Erikson's travels took him to Greenland and to Canada. Possibly also a woman made that voyage several times and set up her own encampments there. The French take over England. This is from the Bayeux Tapestry, which shows the Norman invasion. The reconquest of territory from Islam. And then this, which was just, it was such an ethical dilemma. Such an ethical dilemma. Weapons of mass destruction become an issue with this. You see what makes this a weapon of mass destruction and an ethical problem? This bow will shoot a mile. It can be planted. And when it's drawn back, it has incredible velocity that it puts on the arrow. You can kill a person you never see. How is that ethical for generations of warriors? The glory of war is the fair combat, is the fight between you and a person you see. You have to look each other in the eye. Now it becomes possible to kill in cold blood and anonymity. And people were very divided over this weapon. Of course, it stayed. So there are new moral issues that arise in this time frame as well. So I have a question for you. The only one who might not be able to answer it is Vartan. The rest of us are good. Where were you on December 31st, 1999?
Oh,
Hmm?
nice.
I was in Jerusalem, listening to
Oh.
cop cars coming down my very quiet street to arrest my neighbor, who had decided, since this is going to be the apocalyptic year, that he would rent a tank in order to, take advantage of the situation, I guess, afterwards, and keep his family safe. And the military wanted it back. So the police came to arrest him and take the tank away. Pretty interesting. There was also a large group of Koreans who dressed in white and went up on top of the Mount of Olives because they expected that the Lord would come and take them that evening. And he did not, nor at any subsequent time during the next few days, at which point they got hungry and cold and came down. So the big deal about the turning of a millennium also applied in the century that we're talking about. So whether you're Normans building castles in England and putting nice moats in them, whether you're Byzantines and Romans who are splitting apart from each other in a final schism, or whether you are people who are ultimately going to be going on a crusade, the reason why you're doing these things, the backdrop to whatever you're doing, is the millennium. 999 turns to 1000. And even though that is not the Armenian calendar, or the Jewish calendar, or for the matter of that, the Muslim calendar, there was something about this millennial business, especially in Europe, but also in places that were aware of it, that really changed how people were thinking about the world. There's a kind of a prophetic fervor that comes over people in this time period. Plus, there's a lot of thought like, well, if the world ends in 6 months, so you're in the middle of the year, if the world ends in 6 months, what do I want to be doing? You can imagine for some people that's probably uplifting, and for other people it's probably a great opportunity for crime, overspending, or whatever else. But it affects how people are dealing with things. All right. So we're going to have the long shadow of the millennium to talk about. We also have to take into account that Armenia begins this millennial century cut up into a bunch of little kingdoms. In the middle of the century, a lot of it is going to end up in Byzantium, and then at the end, there's going to be nothing. So people who were born at the beginning of the century, who live in the beginning of the century, have a completely different Armenian experience than people who live in the middle, and a completely different experience again from people who live at the end. There's like almost no common ground. So it felt apocalyptic, I'm sure. You have so much change happening so fast. Relatively speaking, I mean, grandchildren couldn't understand the stories their grandparents told them because the places aren't there anymore. So, in that situation, what are the immediate issues for the church? And we can put them all as questions. What do we do when? In light of the coming end of the world, what do we do when the Caucasian Albanians want a divorce, just like the Georgians got a divorce from the Armenians? How do we deal with that? Do we make a big thing out of it, or do we say, it's only for a few years? Give them what they want. What do we do when the grassroots movement keeps pushing the church, keeps challenging why we do things, keeps persecuting people who actually go to the mainstream church. What do we do when the Byzantines hate us? Because they did in this time period. How do we react? Do we fight, or do we say, okay, let Jesus deal with it? He's coming soon. How about sharing space with Muslims? Might this whole millennial idea have some influence on Armenian tolerance? Like, yeah, whatever. Oh, the more things change, the more they stay the same. What do we do when the youth are not interested in Armenian stuff? They want to date Muslim girls and they want to, you know, dress like everybody else. What do we do in a situation where everybody is a mystic? Or they think they are. And that means that there is no kind of solid ground. And you have to explore things like, okay, what's the difference between being a Sufi mystic, an Armenian mystic, a Byzantine mystic? Does any of it actually matter in the light of the end of the world? And then what about supporting secular authorities who are, in this case, not Armenian, without compromising the church's soul? Armenians have always been good citizens. But what about, you know, St. Paul said, do that, right? But what about when the authorities you want to support are also persecuting your church? And the ecumenical complications that this implies, with the Byzantines in particular, are very complex by the end of this century. There is a new low that's reached in Armenian and Byzantine relationships. The Katoigos Anania Mogatsi ordered the rebaptizing of Chalcedonians. Byzantines tortured non-Chalcedonian clergy. In the light of the coming millennium, what do you do with that? What about things in Islamic culture that Armenians are going to copy assiduously? For example, Armenians have an issue. Youth are uninterested in Armenian faith. Not true of Islamic youth. Islamic youth are very into their faith. So what are they doing? How are they accomplishing this? And so Armenians began studying Islamic youth organizations and adopting them for themselves. So, it's a lot going on. And then everything changes because you no longer have 2 great and 8 small kingdoms in Armenia. You have instead this: the arrival of the Seljuk Turks as a political and military force is going to change life, not just in Armenia, but in the entire region. By 1045, they had spread across Persia. 1055, they are in Baghdad, claiming power for their leader by calling him the Sultan and King of East and West. They were not interested at all, really, in what the Byzantines were doing. They considered them insignificant. What they were interested in was their real competitors, the Fatimids in Egypt, who were Shia Muslims. And the thing that stood between the Seljuks and the Shia Fatimids whose territory came right up into Edessa. What's standing in between is Armenia. Armenians are already very familiar with Turkic peoples. Populations of them, mercenaries from the Caliphate army, have been settled in Armenia. Some of the bloodiest campaigns that took place in Armenia under the Caliphate were led by Turkish generals. And so this new force in the area, again, Armenians negotiated already their way of existing together with Islam, meaning Sunni Islam. Now they have to renegotiate it with Shia Islam. So here's a nice picture of Turks coming into the area. With their different types of weaponry. And their extremely efficient military. And so the map of the area is going to look like this. You have Seljuks kind of bleeding over 2/3 of the way to Istanbul. You have a little bit of red and pink left that's Byzantine. But the world has suddenly become Turkish across this century. Later, that will get much more complicated. There'll be many more different types of Turks. And Armenia is no longer this, where you have a nice big Armenian kingdom of Vaspurakan, a nice big greater Armenian kingdom at the top, and some little Islamic things. No, instead, this is what you get. So as this begins to happen, as Turks begin to take over Armenian territory, there are some events that happen that they don't seem that significant at the time, but they really became paradigmatic. In other words, they became a model to be copied by others. One was just seemed to be a personal matter. A prince named Vasak Pahlavuni. And you can tell his family name is the same family name as Grigor Lusaboric, so he has a blood relationship somehow to him. Was martyred by the Turks. And that event totally changed the life of his son. And from that son would come 3 new Katoigoses, a new line of St. Gregory's blood leading the Armenian church. So out of this personal trauma is going to come a big renaissance, not an uncontested renaissance, but a renaissance in the ideology of having a church that's led by direct connection to Grigor Lusaboric. A second thing that happened became a model to be followed. Didn't start out that way, nobody intended for it, but the man who governed Vaspuragan, you can see Vaspuragan is the east end of things. It's right in the way of the Seljuks. They're going to hit there first in Armenian territory. The king of Vaspuragan happened to be named Sennacherib, which is not an Armenian name. Anybody familiar with their Old Testament will know Sennacherib, one of the kings who attacked Israel. Sennacherib's family traced their origins back to that king. he was very concerned about this whole Turkish thing. Meanwhile, he had heard that his neighbor, a guy named Davi, who ruled the area of Tyke. This is his processional cross. So you can see it's unusual processional cross. It has Christ on the cross. So this guy is not like Armo in his faith. This is somebody who's influenced by Byzantines and things more to the west. He knew that David had made an agreement with the Byzantines that when he died, his lands would go to the emperor. He made the emperor his heir. And it was fortunate that he did, because he was assassinated right at the turn of the century, right in the millennial year. How awful is that? And that the fact that that land had been given to the emperor prevented all kinds of civil war and bloodshed in his home province. And so Sennacherib also had a son named David. So he sent his son to Constantinople to say, okay, what would you give us if we did the same? Now, Vaspuragan is a nice big chunk of territory. And the Byzantines said, well, that's an interesting prospect. You really want to do this? Let's talk about it. And so Sennacherib traded Vaspuragan, which looks a lot like this, for an approximately equivalent quantity of land. He did it before he died, too. He didn't make the emperor his heir. Here, this is Sivas, Sebastia. We have any Sebastats around. This is the hometown. So this is Sebastia, and this is its province. And if you look at it, it's kind of the same size and shape as Vaspuragan. And in fact, it was a bit bigger. This is what it looked like under the Ottomans. It would go almost down, to the water and up to the water. So it was like they were offering a buffer zone again to Sennacherib and his heirs, but it would be farther inland. It would be in a little more secure location. And Sennacherib was really thrilled about this idea, because nobody could foresee at that point that the Byzantine government was going to implode and was going to go downhill very rapidly. And so he said, sure, I'll trade Vaspuragan. Anybody who wants to leave Vaspuragan and come with me, we're going. Which probably meant that a lot of the peasants and farmers and things like that just stayed where they were and hoped for the best. And most of the nobility left. Now that might seem really, really, really odd to us. I mean, what kind of an Armenian, we might think, would sell his fatherland in that way? However, Sennacherib was a very pious man. And one day he had been praying over this situation. Dear God, what do you want me to do? What's the best thing for my people and me? And he did something which I hope none of us has done, but I'm fairly sure that with a number of Protestant influence in the room, probably we have. He asked for a Bible. And when his servant brought the Bible, what do you think he did with it? He opened it, put his finger on a verse.
Yeah, I've done it.
Divine guidance.
Yeah.
Matthew 10:23 is what his finger landed on, which says, when they persecute you in one city, flee to another. And then the verse ends, until the end comes. You will not have gone through all the cities, etc., until the end comes. And for him, the operative phrase was that the end comes, because he was thinking millennially. So what difference would it make if he lived in Vaspuragan, or he lived a couple 100 miles away in Sebastia? It was all going up in flames anyhow. He had no way of foreseeing that it was not going to end anything. On their part, the Byzantines agreed to this deal because they were also concerned about Turks. And they knew that the Armenians are the buffer between them and the Turks. But after Emperor Basil passed, gradually there was a decrease in the trust that the Byzantine government placed in its Armenian population. And so what was making the Byzantine emperor nervous was the idea that his buffer zone was in the hands of Armenians. And so he figured, let's move them all out. And I will send colonizing Greeks, Byzantines, of other varieties, to occupy that space, and then I will have a dependable buffer zone. There was a serious problem with that calculation, but it did not occur to him at that moment. And that same consideration is going to apply when the Byzantines consider, here's a nice picture of, this is actually a great picture. This is one of the last pictures on Ahtamar, the island in Lake Van. This is the throne of Sennacherib, which was kept in the Vank there. Now, of course, it's disappeared. But here you have some nice vanagons and a couple of altar servers. And there, by golly, is the throne of the last king of Vaspuragan. Can you imagine having that stored in your basement? So with the Bagratid kingdom centered on Ani, we'll spend some time looking at this, was also a concern to the Byzantines, and it was a concern to itself as well. Because as the middle of the century approached, there was serious, I mean, you think Spare is causing problems. There was serious difficulty within the royal family. King Gagik I, who's shown here with his lovely wife, died after an immensely powerful reign of almost 30 years. Left behind him 2 sons, which would normally make a father proud, but they were absolutely opposite to one another in body and character. And the parents had never been able to make them friends, let alone make them supportive of each other. Their oldest boy was named Hovannes Sambat. They gave him a hyphenated name. The younger brother was named Ashok, short and sweet. Hovannes Sambat, very intelligent, very capable in terms of administration. But one very polite historian describes him as being rich in flesh, meaning he was obese. And he was militarily completely inept. Another historian calls him lazy, lax, and unprepared for war. That's not a good combination of traits in a king. Another kind person said that it took a winch to get him onto his horse. And when the occasion demanded that he sit on a horse, They had to make a contraption that would lift him up and put him on the horse. And the horse had to be specially bred to be able to carry his weight. Although, as you can see from this, it's not uncommon for a fully armored guy to need some help getting on a horse. And when, as the elder son, he inherited the throne, despite his military incapacities, his brother was really, really turned off. His brother was his opposite. So you can imagine, physically fit, militarily very capable, charismatic, dumb as a doorknob, no administrative skill and no diplomatic intelligence at all. You know, he was a hit him and get it done. And of course, their father is dead by the time Hovhannes Sambat becomes king, and Ashot refused to recognize his brother as king. Went off, left the capital city, went out to live in the countryside, taking most of the military with him because they liked his style. And a civil war began between the brothers. Ultimately, they're going to divide the kingdom between them. Hovhannes Sambat will be king in the city of Ani, where his skills were at their best. His brother will be king of everything else. It was just better that they not be in the same space. And there are some fantastic stories about how different people try to reconcile these guys. Hovhannes Sambat, for example, calls his brother, sends messengers to his brother, I'm sick. I don't think I'm going to make it. Come and see me. And Ashot is like, you know, I'm conflicted about whether I want to go to or not. But he went, he did the Christian thing. He went, he sat down next to his brother, took his brother's hand, and his brother pressed the button that opened the door underneath Ashot's seat and dropped him into a dungeon. So you can imagine. This is a great problem for the Katoigos of the time. The Katoigos of the time was really no saint. Not in the sense that we would normally think of it anyway. His name was Petros I. He has no place name after him, unlike most Katoigoses. Even though he was from Sebastia, actually. He's not known to history as Petros Sebastatsi. Instead, he has another name. And he got it like this. In the first year of the rule of Hovhannes Sambat in the city and Ashot outside, an arrangement that the Katoigos actually brokered, he happened to be in Trebizond, Black Sea resort, where the Byzantine emperor was spending the winter as well. He was not stupid. He wanted opportunities to get on the good side of the Byzantines. It's a beautiful mountainous area. Numerous ancient monasteries dotted around it. And at Epiphany, for us Nativity, the baptism of Jesus was celebrated in the water of this river, the river Mashka. And because the Katoigos was there, the emperor and the Byzantine bishop invited him to attend, and they asked him to participate, do a little bit of your blessing of the water service. Byzantine bishops present would bless it in their own right. So it was a very nice gesture. And according to someone who was a contemporary, said when the patriarch, the Armenian patriarch that is, poured the dominical oil onto the water, sparkles of light suddenly danced on the water. So there's suddenly the sun breaks through the clouds. just as Petros is doing the Armenian prayer. Everyone present saw them, they glorified God, and our faith was exalted. This is a great story. It's too great a story to leave it alone. And so it's repeated again and again over the next several hundred years by different people. And let me tell you how it develops. A century and a half after the event, a historian writes, the patriarch prayed, and light shone forth from the patriarch's hand when he poured the oil onto the water, to the astonishment of all who witnessed it. A century after that, a historian says, the Lord Petros stopped the river for an hour by a miracle of the Holy Cross in the presence of the emperor. And even later, this is amazing. A historian named Sumbat writes, a great fire appeared above the water, and the water was still for a time. And then we get this one. This is like the best one. The historian Giragos, another 150 years later, 100 years later, when the Holy Patriarch Petros prayed, the water turned back, and a great light arose which outshone the light of the sun. So we've gone from having sparkles on the water, which the Byzantines appreciated as a nice sign of the Armenians' prayer being acceptable, to this incredible thing that happens. And so Petros is known to history, not as Petros Sebastatsi, but as Petros Kedatarts, Petros who turned back the river. I'm spending some time on him because it's going to be very important in what comes next. He was a very controversial Katolikos, and the controversy over him continues till today. You can find people writing wonderful things about him and people who can't really hate him. Far from being an exemplary ascetic, he had a very highly developed love of luxury goods. And so there's this wonderful story that's told. He gets an audience with the emperor. The emperor wants to be very polite to him and show him respect. And so the emperor sets a silver filigreed throne for the Katolikos to sit upon while they converse. And when the interview was over and the Katolikos got up to leave, began to walk out, his servants picked up the throne and started to walk out with it. And the emperor is like, that stays here. And the servants replied in shocked tones, anything our Katolikos has touched partakes of the sacredness of his person. Therefore, it becomes his property. And the emperor was sufficiently shocked that he just let it go. Who knows? These Armenians are very weird. There were also other controversial aspects to his life. As I mentioned, he's the one who brokered the agreement between Hovhannes Sumbat and Ashot about splitting the kingdom. But in addition, there was an extra clause on that, because it seemed so obvious to people that Hovhannes Sumbat, in his obesity, was hardly likely to produce an heir. Whereas Ashot probably would. And so the agreement said that when Hovhannes Sumbat died, Ashot would inherit. And Hovhannes Sumbat signed that agreement, but in his heart he was thinking, over my dead body, brother, you're not getting anything. And he fully expected to die first too. So in order to prevent Ashot from becoming king, he made a will, leaving the Bagratid kingdom to the Byzantine emperor. and he didn't tell people about this, but nobody could foresee that the emperor he left it to would die the same year he made the will. The will is now irrevocable because it's been sent to Istanbul or sent to Constantinople for recording. The emperor he willed it to died. His successor was not somebody that Hovhannes Sumbat would have wanted to give his land to. And to make it like a perfect tragedy, Ashok died. So Hovhannes Sumbat's revenge against his brother was totally unnecessary. And here's the problem for Katolikos Petros, because it seems almost certain that he is the one who took Hovhannes Sumbat's documents to Byzantium and who may have actually helped to engineer this whole fiasco. From the point of view of a modern person looking at this means that the Katolikos is a traitor. The Katolikos has handed over Armenia's biggest kingdom to the Byzantines, has just given it away, and in the end, for nothing. So from the point of view of a 21st century person, this is reprehensible, this is despicable, there is no justification for this whatsoever. But from the point of view of the 11th century, it looks different. The Katolikos was very certain that he had inside information about how the world was going to end and what was going to happen before that. I mentioned earlier the man Krikor, whose father Vasak was martyred by the Turks. Krikor grew up to be an extraordinary intellectual. He translated Plato and Euclid into Armenian, so philosophy and mathematics. He had a bet with a Muslim that he could write the Bible in verse in 4 days, and he did it. He was learned in all cultures, a very sophisticated man. This is part of the decoration from the church he built at Havut's Tar. But while he was perfectly capable of dabbling in the Islamic world, he was very pro-Byzantine, as was the Katolikos. Even though they were Lusavorchagan totally in their faith, they were very pro-Byzantine in their politics. And this despite the fact that Katolikos Petros was imprisoned several times by the Byzantines, at least once at Krikor's fortress, which is a great place called Bijni. It's very lovely. Why would he be so convinced that the Byzantines are the horse to back, even when they persecute Armenians, even when they imprison him personally? Why was he so sure? Again, he had inside information. He also had some practical skills. He was looking around and seeing that in the 11th century, Armenians are very, very highly placed in the Byzantine state. So a guy named John Gurguas, in other words, Hovhannes Gurgen, was governor of Italy for the Byzantines. The head of Mount Athos was a guy named Theoctistus, who signed his name in Armenian. He headed 7 monasteries in a consortium. The family of the Petroses, eminent in both religious and bureaucratic life, and there are only a few. 10% of the nobility overall in Byzantium are Armenian. 25% or more of the military aristocracy are Armenian, and 10% of the civil service, all Armenians. So there's a sound basis there, the Katolikos thought, and Krikor agreed with him, for thinking that in the future, Armenia will certainly find the Byzantines helpful. So that's one piece. Another piece kind of happened accidentally. Another piece of their pro-Byzantine fervor. There were shooting stars. There were portents in the heavens. There were weird weather phenomena and so on, like pink rain and things like that. And so the Katolikos and Krikor went on a private mission to ask the wisest man in Armenia what the heck is going on. And the holy man, his name was Hovhannes Gozer, heard their question, withdrew to his cell, prayed and wept, and finally came back with his prophetic insight, his message from God. The Byzantines were destined by God, after a very difficult period, to have a renaissance of power. They would dominate the Mediterranean world once more, as they had done in the past. And I believe it was partly their trust, a large part, their trust in his insight, which turned out to be utterly and completely incorrect, that persuaded the Katolikos to throw his weight behind Hovhannes Sambat's plan to give everything to the Byzantines. And so when the keys to the city of Ani, which are not small, these are not Yale keys, these are keys like this, heavy metal keys. When those mysteriously made their way to Constantinople, into the hands of the emperor himself, who else could possibly have taken them there? It was one of those two. It was Petros, or it was Krikor, or it was both. And seeing that things had gone to that degree, that there was no turning back, Hovhannes Sambat was himself appalled when the actual keys turn up in Constantinople. It's like, what? I'm not dead yet. Hovhannes Sambat tried to get the keys back. He tried to annul his will. Not possible. And one reason he really wanted to take it all back was because his brother's kid, a teenage boy named Gagik, who will call himself Gagik II, had everything you could possibly want in a king. He had Hovhannes Sambat's brains. He had his dad's military skill. He was fearless, as we'll see some of the stories about him later on. And so when a Byzantine army arrived after Hovhannes Sambat's death to take over Ani, they met a very determined 15-year-old who refused to surrender the city, even though they had the keys. He sabotaged the locks and made it possible to close the city again. And if it were not for treachery on the part of a pro-Byzantine nobleman inside the city, he would have held the Byzantine army off. He was that good. And the kingdom fell. The Katolikos was arrested by Constantine Dukas, whose coin you see here, and was pressured to turn over the treasury of the Armenian church to the Byzantine patriarch, since everything Armenian was now Byzantine. Armenian churches were sacked and despoiled of their vessels and vestments. Church properties were taken or taxed. And just for fun, you can see why Constantine Ducas needed to collect tax money. Here's a picture of him on the horse at the left, being chased by a bunch of Muslim soldiers. So what does he do in order to get away? He drops a lot of gold coins on the ground to distract them. They stop to collect the coins, he gets away. And it gets worse. During the reign of his son Michael and his regent, the Synod of the Byzantine Church in Constantinople ordered the burning of all Syriac and Armenian sacramental books. They would no longer be needed. The Armenian Church and the Syriac Church, in their mind, were becoming Byzantine. It gets a little worse, but not in this time period. In the 12th century, there's synods that demand that if a Byzantine Christian marries an Armenian or other heretic, they should be forcibly separated and punished. Byzantines who ate with Armenians or Muslims or Jews were excommunicated. So things are kind of at a low point in Armeno-Byzantine relations. So before we talk a little bit more about that, I want to say that in light of that fact, in light of how bad the relationship is between the Byzantines and the Armenians, it's totally amazing that Armenians sent bishops here. Does this look familiar? You know where this is? What about if you look at it like that? Same country. Where did the Armenians provide bishops for? Where is this place?
Those are the
Famous.
Northern Lights.
Yep, you get the Northern Lights and you get volcanic springs. This, my friends, is Iceland.
Oh, how cool.
The Armenians sent bishops to Iceland. The mission of the Armenian bishops, Petros, Stepanos, and Abraham, is mentioned in Icelandic histories as having taken place between the 1040s and the 1070s. So right in the middle of all this stuff.
Why did they choose Iceland?
Because that's where the Norwegian king wanted them to go. The Norwegian king had met Armenians when he was serving in the army in Constantinople, and he kept up his relationship.
Wow.
So he sends them, he puts the bill to send them to Iceland. And what's really funny is they were mightily opposed by the Roman Catholic Bishop of Iceland because they were too popular. In other words, they were less strict than he was, and people would go to hear them. You have Petros, Stepanos, and Abraham. So here you have this phenomenon that while Ani is falling, Armenian church activities are ongoing in weird parts of the world. That's not the only place. Here's a nice picture of a page from a gospel book that was copied in Iceland by a scribe named Hovannes. We have no idea who he was, but he's not one of the three bishops, so they had an entourage. Or maybe there were more Armenians hanging out in Scandinavia. Yeah, it's interesting. And so the Byzantines kind of get a clean sweep of all those untrustworthy Armenians, the heck out of Vaspuragan, get them out of the Bagratid kingdom. Everything will be fine. And then the flaw in the plan became obvious. The Byzantines had planned to move a population of Byzantine military and officials and so on into those areas But we have the diary of one guy who was assigned to go, and he's like, the heck I'm going out there. There are snakes. I don't know if they have any public baths. I don't like the climate. I'm not going. I'd rather lose my job. And he was typical. They were not able to populate that area. And so when the Seljuks got there, they just walked in. There was no defense. And ultimately, the Seljuks would turn out to be, the lesser of the evils. They had an interest in maintaining Ani as a trading center, so they had a lot of it rebuilt. They did a good enough job that an Armenian Catholicosate would center itself there. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So the obvious question is, so where was the Catholicosate if it recenters itself in Ani? It had been in Sivas, it had been in a place called Tavblur, it had been in Argina, it had been in Divin. What name is missing from the list of Catholicosate locations? Etchmiadzin was not there. Etchmiadzin had been a Catholicos maybe for 145, something like that, years. And what do I mean when I say a Catholicosate centered itself there? How many Catholicosates are there? We'll get to that in a minute. The fall of Ani, even if Ani was preserved and upgraded in some ways, was still very traumatic. Ani would never again be ruled by Armenians. Bagratids, Arginids, none of them is going to control Armenian territory again. Obviously, Armenian history didn't stop without an Armenian government. Happened before, it would happen again. It's going to be the predominant pattern in this millennium. There were Armenians who stayed living on their own soil, but other people ruled it. So there are obvious issues for Ekatoligos in this time period, and for clergy who have to pastor people in this time period. Last semester, we talked briefly about Armenian populations who had left Armenia, mostly guys who had served in the Byzantine military, were given land in this area, an area that was known as Cilicia. And so around the fall of Ani, many Armenians left Armenia, not for Sennacherib's territory in Sebastia, which was also an option, but for this. It's a fantastic area. It has the best ports outside of Alexandria. It's got natural fortifications. It's got a wonderful climate that will grow everything from bananas, tropical fruits, to olives, desert fruits, to apples, cold weather fruits. It has incredible beauty and a climate like a resort year-round. Fabulous scenery. It's got ancient cities. It's got trading cities. It's got everything. And so you would think, okay, so Armenians who get out of the way of the Seljuk Turks and come to a place like this, great, fantastic. It's like going to California. But many of the people who had survived the events of the 11th century and who did end up in this beautiful territory, because they were outside their own land, were aware of a kind of schizophrenia in themselves. These people who were caught in the death of one kingdom before there's actually a full Armenian entity in their new location are very interesting people, because they always wanted to go back, and they never did. And so they brought as much of the old world with them into the new as they could. And they always worked towards that illusory goal of going home. One of these figures, probably the most important one for the church history end of things, is this guy. Became known as the Lord Grigoris or the Lord Bahram, depending on when people knew him. He was born Bahram, he became Grigor. He was the son of Grigor Magistros, the one who was the friend of Petros the Catholicos. He had a fantastic career as the Byzantine governor of Mesopotamia. He had a personal fortune. He was married as a young man. He was an odd character. He was married as a young man, but he lived, we're told, an unblemished life with his wife, meaning no sex. And they had no children. So it's like already in this young man, there was a conflict between his family obligations and his personal desire for a more ascetic lifestyle. And it's remarkably similar to the story of Grigor Lusavoric himself, although he did have children, that after a while, Bahram Grigoris separated from his wife, withdrew from political life, did go into a monastery. And he seems to have had a pattern in his life of making really abrupt, big changes like that. It's like he would work them out in his own mind, and then suddenly there they were. Everybody else is a little surprised. Maybe it also was because his father had put some pressure on him. Here's a letter that the Magistros sent to his son. Again, no pressure. Parents do these things to their kids. Wonder why you laugh. So he writes to him and talks about their lineage, their connection to Grigor Lusavoric. So this is a greater gift than gold or jewels or any substance whatsoever. And gathering up learning with a multitude of virtues, I offered it to you without stint, and I have never rested from doing so. In other words, I've given you the best education ever. And he was homeschooled. In return, Dad wasn't doing this for pure love. In return, I expect you never to forget our tradition or the urge of love toward Christ, never to let the light of our ancestors' lamp go out. Anybody who grew up learning Krikori, Gante Gavar, Lusavorci Gante Gavar, Bare Gadzir Ginkits, and so on, the lamp of St. Gregory. I speak of the Parthian, St. Gregory, your forebear. So I've given you all this education. In return, I expect you to live up to your heritage as Grigor Lusavoric's descendant. How does that fit with being governor of Mesopotamia and having a military career? It really doesn't. And so he left his wife, he went into a monastery. And then 6 years after his father finally died, his chance to keep Lusavoric's lamp alight came. In 1065, he's around 40. He was chosen Catholicos, and here's how it happened. Ani fell in 1064. So this is the next year. People are still in shock over the whole Ani thing. And they're in shock because not only did Ani fall, but the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Ducas, the one I showed you the coin from, was determined this is the moment when the Armenians are going to come totally into the Chalcedonian fold. And this wasn't just his religious feeling. One historian says, after all, the Catholic state owned 500 prosperous villages, was served by 500 bishops for 500 sees. The Catholicos' personal entourage included 12 bishops, 4 vartabeds, 60 priests, and 500 servants. In other words, the Catholicos had a team like a king. So behind all of that is a lot of money. In other words, that's what the emperor really wants in this historian's view. And so when the Catholicos died without naming a coadjutor to succeed him, the emperor forbade any election of a new Catholicos and was only persuaded, this is funny, was only persuaded to change his mind when a key Armenian prince, Byzantine civil servant named Gagi Kabasyan, persuaded him that if you think Armenians with a Catholicos are bad, just wait till you see what they're going to be like without one. If you think Armenians are problems now, just wait. And so from the Armenian point, the emperor weakened a little bit, said, okay, if you can find the right person. From the Armenian point of view, and from the Byzantine point of view, the only person on the planet who was a good candidate is Vaharam. He's a celibate member of Krikolu Savoric's family. Armenians are like, yeah, we'll take him. Because this is almost prophetic. You have a chance for the restoration of the founding Catholicosal dynasty in a new country. Very symbolic of the return for which new diaspora and Armenians are longing in their hearts. And then from the Byzantine point of view, is perfect because, like his father, he's been a Byzantine duke. He's served at the highest level in Byzantine military hierarchy. His brother was the Byzantine governor of Antioch. And so they go to him and they say, look, it's you or it's nobody. We know you don't really want this job, but we beg you to do it. Because if you refuse, there is no one else. And we have just handed not only Ani and Vaspuragan, but the church over to the Byzantines. Your choice, no pressure. And so it was like fate appointed this poor guy. And he bowed to the inevitable. And he said, okay, I will do it. He was going to put some conditions on that. And he chose as his seat this castle called Zamantav, which was Gagi Kabasyan's fort, the one who had put him in the position. It's a place with a very commanding position. You can see it at the top of this hill. And we'll be coming back to it at another point. It was not gifted with a coastal resort climate. This is out in the desert. So what conditions did he put on this? Four years in, he held a meeting to say, I need to strike a balance in my life. I left the worldly position that I had because I'm sick of administration. Administration, in my opinion, doesn't serve Christ in the way I want to serve him. And so I'm going to leave. I'm going to make an extended pilgrimage. I'm going to go to Rome. I'm going to go to Egypt. I'm going to go to the Holy Land. I have things I need to do on this pilgrimage. While I'm away, I am appointing as my locum tenens my placeholder, Kevork of Lori. He's my old friend, monastic partner. He's a highly respected Bartabed. He was, when I began my monk life, he was my mentor. Now, the two of them had an agreement between themselves that they would help each other out. Kevork would do the administration while Krikor was out on his big pilgrimage. When Krikor came back, Kevork would go out. So they would each get a break. They could take a pilgrimage, they could go into a retreat, whatever they wanted to do. So there would be a kind of shared katoigosate. And the princes are like, no, we don't like that. We don't like that agreement. And Krikor is like, oh, this is what I'm offering. I'm not negotiating. I'm leaving. And if you don't like it, then appoint whoever you want as katoigos. I don't even have to come back. And logically enough, they said, well, okay, if that's how you want it, we're fine with that. You can go. You've left us Kevork. We're okay with him as katoigos. And so while Krikor went off on his pilgrimage, the princes approached Kevork and said, we're happy to have you have the full katoigosate since he's just abdicated. And then when he came back, everybody's a little confused. Nice to see you. Thought you abdicated. Would you like to see the katoigos? And he was really, 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 really upset. Mostly upset with Kevork. He's like, so why didn't you tell them about her? Why didn't you? I'm back. You're supposed to withdraw now. And Kevork is like, dude, you made it unclear. You're the one who said you were leaving. How is this my fault? And so this lovely friendship breaks apart completely. Krikor resumes his position. Kevork goes off and becomes bishop / katoigos. We don't know. It seems like he got to keep the title. But became katoigos of an outlying part of the Cilician territory. So now you have two katoigoses. And then what? You now have Armenians living in Egypt. What are you going to do for them? You also have a prince, an Armenian prince in a separate area saying, I would like to have someone come and be katoigos of my area. We're mostly Greek speaking over here. And so Krikor says, okay, here's your katoigos. Now you have 1, 2, 3. There's going to be another one in Egypt, so that's 4. When the katoigos sitting in the Greek-speaking area decides he's not going to move to the new place they want him, they appoint another one. Now there's 5. What is this? We are so used to the idea that it's a scandal to have 2 katoigosates. What would we make of this? Then you count the Albanian katoigos. There are 7 katoigoses. And then there is an 8th one, Anachtamar, who's just called Mivoman, somebody. All of them were either suggested or actually instated by Krikor. So this is one of the experiments in church organization for dealing with new situations. If you have Armenians in Egypt and you cannot go to Egypt yourself, you put a fully empowered Catholicos there. If the people in Ani come to you and say, we would like the Catholicos say here, you say, good, here's a Catholicos for you. And it seems like Krikor had in his mind the idea that there would be a Catholicos of Catholicoses who would kind of be ultimately responsible, but these guys are fully empowered in their own regions to do whatever needs to be done. Okay, so why have I got 999 on the board?
Is that when this all was happening?
No, this is when the problem begins. Everybody in the Christian world who knew about the Western calendar, as we said, had millennial expectations. And people were certainly expecting the arrival of Christ, New Year 1000. It didn't happen. So what do? I don't know if you remember this. There was a guy on Christian Family Radio a couple of years ago who had calculated the dates for the end of the world and who announced the end of the world would take place on such and such a date. And all of his followers were very involved in this. Do you remember this, Sarah?
Yes, I heard about it.
Yeah, I think his last name was Camping. He's no longer with them, with Family Radio, I don't believe. And the date came and went. And so he recalculated and announced the new date for the end of the world, and the date came and went. And I think on the third try, they were like, okay, shut up. It's enough of that. It was kind of like that. In 1000, people are like, well, when in 1000 might it be? And then 1000 passed and we're in 1001. And then it's like, oh my God, maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's the millennial century and he'll come at the end of the century. And so this becomes very important. Will it be in 1099? And that intervening 100 years was a time of expansion and organization and administrative reform in European Christianity. The Latin church became very militarized. Clergymen became landowners, served in the military, owed military men to their secular lords and so on. Bishops went to war in person. The Pope participated, was a major landowner in Europe, had a private army, larger than any other private landowner. And the comparative authority of kings and popes became a big issue. And so looking at this date, 1099, the church in Europe was looking for a way to increase its, on the one hand, looking at it from a cynical point of view, to increase its standing vis-a-vis the secular governments of Europe. And as well, for those who were faithful, to think of how would you like to greet the Lord on his return? Where would you like to be and what would you want to be doing? Always a good question to ask oneself when one is tempted to do things that are less than lovely. Would I want to die at this moment? Would I want the rapture to happen at this moment? You know, whatever it is. And it was decided that, since there was other stories that fed into this, that the best thing a Christian could possibly be doing at the Lord's return was to be found liberating Jerusalem, the city where he died and rose again, from the control of Islam. And the Europeans seem to have been quite blissfully unaware that to get to Jerusalem you have to pass through lands that belong to other people. And so here's a set of the different routes that people took to get to Jerusalem. None of them successfully avoids other people's territory. And they had no idea, they were very insulated. They had no idea that the people they would be meeting, obviously Muslims were the devil, but they had no idea that Byzantines and other types of Christians would have very little in common with them, actually. And there was a lot of bad feeling that very quickly grew up between the Europeans and the very sophisticated Byzantines. Byzantines didn't fight. Byzantines hired people to fight. Byzantines didn't do dirty work. They hired people to do dirty work. And there you suddenly have Byzantium encountering these barbaric people who, whereas Byzantines, in everybody at their home has a heated bath, right? Europeans might, you know, if they swam, they were cleaner, but they considered that bathing was bad for your health. And so you can imagine what it was like to be in a room full of them. So here you have all these brawny, smelly, tall, pale-eyed, pale-haired people who lived in drafty towers, not in palaces lined with, you know, gold thread and things like that. And the Byzantines are like, just get them out of here. And the Crusaders are like, what a bunch of pansies. These people are just wimps. Look at that. That is supposed to be a real ruler, looking at the Byzantine emperor. And there he's standing in a dress with embroidery on it. There was nothing in common, and they couldn't stand each other. But Armenians were a whole different thing. Byzantium and Rome didn't have religious relationships. Armenians didn't have anything against Rome. Armenians practically never heard of it. Armenians also had a military aristocracy, which the Europeans also understood. One problem in their learning to love Armenians was the difference in status between Armenian and European women. The status of women in Armenian society was higher. And Europeans had to get used to that when they started marrying them. And very soon, because there was this kind of natural interest between Europeans and Armenians, there would be no Crusader family that did not have an important Armenian component, or a kingdom without an important cadre of Armenian merchants and architects. So when the crusade came in 1099 to meet Christ in Jerusalem, on the way they took Antioch, biggest city in the east, with the help of Armenians. That's a story for another day. They took other areas that were populated by Armenians: Tarsus, Adana, Mamestia, Edessa, Latakia. Here you have a nice picture of the Crusader new ruler of, I think it's Edessa, receiving a delegation of Armenians who are coming to compliment him on his success. And of course, Jerusalem. In fact, when the crusade took Jerusalem on a very hot day in July 1099, Krikor Vagayaser was actually there on one leg of his pilgrimage, and was taken by the Muslim government of Jerusalem as a hostage to ensure the loyalty of Armenians within the city. He was held here, and it's one of those amazing stories. He and the other prisoners, the other hostages, were taken out into the courtyard to be executed. And just as they were about to be killed, the crusade breached the wall in the south part of the city, just a few feet from here, and they escaped. So was a pretty traumatic moment. And the Crusaders killing everything in their path. Here's the inside of that fortification. Made their way to the Holy Sepulchre Church, wading through blood and bodies, we're told, because they didn't discriminate between, a Christian Arab or a Muslim Arab or anybody. They all look the same. They're all kind of brown and they have beards. So they did a lot of indiscriminate slaughter on their way to give thanks at the Holy Sepulchre for having succeeded in liberating the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection from Islamic hands. So, as the crusade is passing through and coming in Jerusalem, this is just kind of fun. The first king of Jerusalem, Crusader king of Jerusalem, this is a picture of him, Godfrey de Bouillon. He refused to be called king of Jerusalem. He wanted to be called the protector of the Holy Sepulchre. He only reigned for a single year, but it was the pinnacle year of his life, you better believe it. The next generation of rulers of Jerusalem will be half Armenian. Every major principality in the Middle East was ruled by an Armenian woman at one point in this period. It's just absolutely fascinating. And each of those women is like something out of a soap opera. It's just amazing, the stories that come out. So as all of this is happening in the south, as the crusade is passing through Cilicia, as it's leaving in its wake new patterns of alliances, things in the Armenian homelands go on like they always did. With the Armenians in the western end of that being governed by Seljuks, people in the east being governed by Seljuks and other little random Islamic groups, and a lot of Chalcedonian influence radiating out of Sebastia and Kayseri and drawing in forcibly the Armenian populations there. And you can see a bifurcation is born. So you have the Cilician / Crusader segment of Armenian life with its access to power through marriages and so on. And you have the homeland Armenians who were doing their best to tread water and stay alive under Turks. Their attitudes towards life and what it means to be an Armenian are going to be very, very different. It's not like there will be a complete separation, but there's certainly a widening gap between Armenians in the diaspora who consider themselves to be true Armenians because they survived all of this stuff, and Armenians in the homeland who consider themselves to be true Armenians because they didn't leave. So that's that for this evening.